suddenly in foreign chronicles. The invasion story begins with movement into Scandinavia, not just movement out of it. And that possibility changes how we understand Viking power. Their success was not based only on violence. It depended on shipbuilding knowledge, navigation, political organization, intelligence, trade contacts, and the ability to operate across cultures. A closed and isolated population would have struggled to build networks from North America to the Black Sea. The Viking world expanded because it could absorb people and information. Foreign craftsmen brought techniques. Merchants brought knowledge of ports and currencies. Intermarriage created family links abroad. Captives added labor and, eventually, descendants. Travelers carried news of weak kingdoms, rich monasteries, river routes, market towns, and political conflicts. Diversity was not merely an accidental result of Viking expansion. It may have helped make expansion possible, but this does not mean everyone in Scandinavia welcomed outsiders equally. Genetic diversity varied by location. Coastal trading centers may have been far more cosmopolitan than remote valleys. Political elites may have used marriage to build foreign alliances, while rural communities remained locally rooted. Some migrants could gain status, others were exploited. Some identities blended peacefully, others were imposed through conquest. The Viking world was not a modern multicultural ideal. It was a harsh society organized by rank, wealth, family, freedom, and power. That is why DNA must not be turned into a new romantic myth. The evidence does not show a world without boundaries. It shows that those boundaries were crossed, sometimes by love, sometimes by commerce, sometimes by ambition, and sometimes by force. There's another danger hidden inside the modern fascination with Viking genetics. Commercial ancestry tests often encourage customers to imagine that a small DNA percentage can prove they are descended from Vikings, but there is no single Viking gene. Viking identity existed during a historical period and depended on culture, activity, community, and circumstance. Most people with Scandinavian ancestry today descend from enormous numbers of individuals who lived during the Viking Age. Some of those ancestors may have sailed on raids, others never left their farms. Inheritance becomes fragmented over generations. Your family tree expands faster than your genome can preserve equal pieces from every ancestor. The further back we travel, the more ancestors may exist on paper, and the fewer recognizable genetic segments survive from each one. So the search for pure Viking, the Viking Age. Hunter-gatherers entered the north after the Ice Age. Early farmers brought ancestry ultimately connected to Anatolia. Steppe pastoralists later transformed much of Europe during the Bronze Age. Additional movements arrived from the Baltic, Central Europe, Britain, Ireland, and elsewhere. By the time the first longships appeared in written records, Scandinavia already contained thousands of years of migration. The Vikings did not emerge from untouched bloodlines. They emerged from history. Then they carried that history across the sea. In England, Scandinavian settlers entered regions already shaped by Celtic, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, and continental migrations. In Ireland, Norse newcomers founded or developed trading centers and mixed with local populations. In Iceland, settlers carried ancestry from Scandinavia and from the Gaelic-speaking regions of Britain and Ireland. In the east, Scandinavian travelers followed river systems through territories inhabited by Finnic, Baltic, and Slavic peoples. Some reached the Byzantine world. Others traded with networks connected to the Islamic caliphates. Every region changed the people who arrived. A Viking who spent years in Dublin was no longer shaped only by Norway. A family raised in Kiev could combine Scandinavian ancestry with Eastern European language, marriage, politics, and culture. A child born in Iceland might have a Scandinavian father and a Gaelic mother. Identity moved in both directions. The travelers changed foreign lands. Foreign lands changed the travelers. This is why the image of a single Viking type fails. There was no one Viking experience. A warrior from central Sweden buried at Salma belonged to a different world from a local man buried with Norse objects in Scotland. A merchant in Denmark did not share the same life as a farmer in Iceland. A Scandinavian serving the Byzantine emperor stood inside a political universe far removed from a raider attacking an English coast. They were connected by networks, technologies, stories, and traditions. But they were not interchangeable. Even the familiar national categories, Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish Vikings, must be used carefully. Modern borders did not exist in their present form. Political authority was divided among local rulers, rival dynasties, entre communities, and shifting kingdoms. Genetic patterns broadly connect some overseas expansions to different Scandinavian regions, but human movement rarely followed perfect national lines. A ship's crew could be mixed. A leader could recruit abroad. A person born in one region might settle in another before joining an expedition. DNA reveals tendencies, not uniform armies. And here lies the greatest twist. The science did not destroy Viking history. It made Viking history more human. The myth offered an army of identical blonde warriors emerging from a frozen racial homeland. The evidence reveals brothers dying together in a ship, immigrants entering Scandinavian ports, local Britons adopting Norse identities. Brown-haired sailors standing beside blonde ones, families formed across seas, captives whose names disappeared but whose descendants survived, farmers who never raided anyone, merchants who understood several cultures, children who inherited more than one world. The Viking Age becomes more dramatic when purity disappears, because the story is no longer about a single people moving across a map. It is about thousands of individuals negotiating who they were. Still, the research is unfinished. New graves are being excavated. Sequencing methods continue to improve. DNA fragments once considered too damaged may become usable. Future studies could reveal migration at the level of individual towns and valleys. They may identify more families buried far apart. They may show whether certain foreign ancestry entered through women, men, or both. They could reveal how epidemics, famine, warfare, and climate shaped which communities survived. And each discovery may overturn another image we currently mistake for certainty. That is the strange power of ancient DNA. Written history usually preserves kings, battles, treaties, and disasters. Genetics preserves people who never had their names written down. The woman transported across the North Sea, the child born in a trading settlement, the local fighter accepted into a Norse war band, the four brothers placed together inside a ship. They left no memoirs, but small parts of their lives survived inside teeth and bone. Under sterile laboratory light, those fragments are now being read, not as messages deliberately left for us, but as biological traces that outlived every kingdom they knew. And the message is clear. A Viking identity could be inherited, but it could also be learned. It could be adopted. It could be imposed. It could be shared by people whose ancestors came from different shores. Modern Danish associated ancestry was detected in England. The sea routes drawn on historical maps were visible inside human genomes, but then the neat lines began to break apart. The scientists discovered that Viking era Scandinavia was not one genetically uniform homeland. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark contained noticeable regional structure. Communities separated by mountains, forests, and waterways did not mix equally. Southern Scandinavia appears to have been especially diverse, while some inland and northern populations experienced more limited gene flow. In other words, the Viking world was connected across oceans, but some neighboring Scandinavian communities remained genetically distinct. That was the first warning that the familiar picture was too simple. The second warning was much larger. Ancestry was not only flowing out of Scandinavia, it was flowing in. Before and during the Viking Age, people carrying ancestry connected to southern and eastern Europe entered Scandinavia. Later research, examining hundreds of ancient Scandinavian genomes, also found significant British Irish and Eastern Baltic ancestry in Viking period populations. Imagine the ports at night. A longship glides toward a timber dock. Its sail is lowered. Ropes tighten around wooden posts. But the people stepping onto shore are not all returning Scandinavian warriors. Some may be merchants, some may be craftspeople, some may be spouses, some may be captives taken during raids, others may be diplomats, religious travelers, mercenaries, or families searching for opportunity. They arrive carrying languages, technologies, stories, and DNA. That genetic evidence transforms Scandinavia from an isolated northern fortress into a crossroads. The Viking Age was not simply an explosion from the north into the rest of Europe. It was also a period in which the outside world moved north. But to understand why that matters, we must confront the myth scientists were actually testing. The myth was never just that Vikings came from Scandinavia. Many of the people involved in Viking expeditions clearly did. The deeper myth was that Viking described a biological people, a single ethnic group whose members shared one recognizable appearance and one pure ancestral origin. Modern culture turned the Viking into a race. History suggests something different. The Old Norse world contained farmers, traders, shipbuilders, political leaders, enslaved people, poets, settlers, and fighters. Only a portion of them participated in overseas raiding. Or Denmark. DNA provided a way to test that idea, and one of the clearest pieces of evidence came from Scotland. Archaeologists had discovered burials containing objects and customs associated with Vikings. The dead had been placed in a cultural setting that looked unmistakably Norse, or became part of the political and cultural world created by Scandinavian expansion. Science summarized the implication in a simple but explosive way. People of diverse genetic backgrounds could participate in Viking culture. That changes the scene completely. Picture a young man growing up in the islands of northern Britain. Scandinavian settlers control nearby sea routes. Norse words enter local speech. Foreign ships arrive with silver, weapons, cloth, and stories of distant lands. The young man learns to sail in a Norse-style vessel. He follows a Scandinavian leader. Danish-associated ancestry was detected in England. The sea routes drawn on historical maps were visible inside human genomes, but then the neat lines began to break apart. The scientists discovered that Viking-era Scandinavia was not one genetically uniform homeland. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark contained noticeable regional structure. Communities separated by mountains, forests, and waterways did not mix equally. Southern Scandinavia appears to have been especially diverse, while some inland and northern populations experienced more limited gene flow. In other words, the Viking world was connected across oceans, but some neighboring Scandinavian communities remained genetically distinct. That was the first warning that the familiar picture was too simple. The second warning was much larger. Ancestry was not only flowing out of Scandinavia, it was flowing in. Before and during the Viking Age, people carrying ancestry connected to southern and eastern Europe entered Scandinavia. Later research, examining hundreds of ancient Scandinavian genomes, also found significant British-Irish and Eastern Baltic ancestry in Viking period populations. Imagine the ports at night. A longship glides toward a timber dock. Its sail is lowered. Ropes tighten around wooden posts. But the people stepping onto shore are not all returning Scandinavian warriors. Some may be merchants. Some may be craftspeople. Some may be spouses. Some may be captives taken during raids. Others may be diplomats. Religious travelers, mercenaries, or families searching for opportunity. They arrive carrying languages, technologies, stories, and DNA. That genetic evidence transforms Scandinavia from an isolated northern fortress into a crossroads. The Viking Age was not simply an explosion from the north into the rest of Europe. It was also a period in which the outside world moved north. But to understand why that matters, we must confront the myth scientists were actually testing. The myth was never just that Vikings came from Scandinavia. Many of the people involved in Viking expeditions clearly did. The deeper myth was that Viking described a biological people, a single ethnic group whose members shared one recognizable appearance and one pure ancestral origin. Modern culture turned the Viking into a race. History suggests something different. The Old Norse world contained farmers, traders, shipbuilders, political leaders, enslaved people, poets, settlers, and fighters. Only a portion of them participated in overseas raiding. The term connected with Viking seems to have described an activity or expedition more than a strict genetic identity. A person could go Viking. A community could join Viking networks. Someone could adopt Viking weapons, dress, burial customs, loyalties, and beliefs without having grandparents from Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. DNA provided a way to test that idea, and one of the clearest pieces of evidence came from Scotland. Archaeologists had discovered burials containing objects and customs associated with Vikings. The dead had been placed in a cultural setting that looked unmistakably Norse. Yet genetic analysis indicated that some individuals buried in Viking fashion were genetically similar to local populations rather than migrants from Scandinavia. These were not necessarily Scandinavian invaders buried on foreign soil. They may have been local people who entered Norse communities, adopted Viking identities, or became part of the political and cultural world created by Scandinavian expansion. Science summarized the implication in a simple but explosive way. People of diverse genetic backgrounds could participate in Viking culture. That changes the scene completely. Picture a young man growing up in the islands of northern Britain. Scandinavian settlers control nearby sea routes. Norse words enter local speech. Foreign ships arrive with silver, weapons, cloth, and stories of distant lands. The young man learns to sail in a Norse-style vessel. He follows a Scandinavian leader. He carries a sword made in a northern tradition. He may worship Norse gods, marry into a Norse family, or earn status within their warband. When he dies, he is buried according to the identity he lived. 1,000 years later, archaeologists see the grave and label him a Viking. His genome, however, tells them that his ancestors were local. Does that mean the burial was false? No, it means identity was never controlled by DNA alone. This is one of the most important lessons of the entire investigation. Archaeology studies objects, genetics studies biological ancestry. Neither one, by itself, can fully explain how a person understood who they were. A sword cannot reveal a genome. A genome cannot tell us which god a person worshipped, which language they spoke, or what name they used. The truth lies somewhere between the grave and the bone. Then came another blow to the stereotype: hair color. Popular images usually show Viking warriors with bright blonde hair. That trait certainly existed in Scandinavia, and blonde pigmentation remains common in parts of northern Europe. But the DNA study found that Viking-era people showed more variation than the stereotype suggests. Many likely had brown hair. This did not mean that blonde Vikings were invented. It meant they were not the only Vikings. The northern world contained people with different shades of hair, eyes, and skin pigmentation, shaped by both deep regional ancestry and continuing migration. The Viking face was not one face, it was a crowd. On a dock in Hedeby, one of the great trading centers of the Viking Age, that crowd might have included Scandinavians standing beside Frisians, Slavs, Saxons, Baltic travelers. Amber, furs, enslaved people, and luxury goods moved across immense networks. The Vikings did not sail through an empty ocean. They entered an already connected world, and every trade route could also become a path of migration. The most powerful evidence of those connections does not come from a single dramatic grave. It comes from patterns across hundreds of individuals. In 2023, researchers published a broader analysis of 297 ancient Scandinavian genomes, spanning roughly 2,000 years, on from the Roman Iron Age through the Viking and medieval periods. The study showed that two major streams of external ancestry became visible in Scandinavia. One was connected to the eastern Baltic and was concentrated especially around Gotland and parts of central Sweden. The other was connected to the British and Irish islands and became widespread across Scandinavia during the Viking period. That British-Irish signal raises difficult historical questions. How did those people arrive? Some probably came willingly. Trade and settlement created opportunities. Intermarriage linked families across the North Atlantic. Christian missions, political alliances, and military service moved individuals between courts and communities. But the Viking Age also included violence and slavery. Scandinavian raiders captured people across Britain, Ireland, and other regions. Historical sources and archaeological evidence show that human beings were bought, sold, transported, and forced into labor. Ancient DNA cannot always tell us whether a migrant entered Scandinavia as a free spouse, a skilled artisan, a hostage, or an enslaved captive. The genome records movement. It does not record consent. That silence matters. Behind every ancestry pattern was a human life. A British or Irish woman arriving in Scandinavia might have crossed the sea as a bride, or in chains. A child born later could carry both local Scandinavian and British-Irish ancestry, yet grow up speaking Old Norse and knowing no other home. Within a few generations, a family's foreign origin could disappear from memory while remaining visible in DNA. This is where before the grave was opened, the story seemed simple. A Viking warrior was supposed to look a certain way, tall, pale, blonde-haired, born somewhere in Scandinavia, raised among people who shared the same blood, the same gods, and the same northern ancestry. For generations, paintings, films, museums, and family legends repeated that image until it felt like history. Then scientists began drilling into Viking teeth and bones. Inside those skeletons, they found fragments of DNA that had survived for more than 1,000 years. They compared them with ancient people from across Europe, and with modern Scandinavians living today. The results revealed warriors buried as Vikings, who were not genetically Scandinavian. They revealed Scandinavian communities carrying ancestry from Britain, Ireland, the Baltic, southern Europe, and farther east. They even revealed that some people living in modern Scandinavia may be less genetically similar to certain Viking-era communities than expected. The popular myth was collapsing. But the most unsettling discovery was not about blonde hair, a foreign ancestry, or ancient migration. It was about the meaning of the word Viking itself. And buried beneath that single word was a forgotten world far more complicated than anything Hollywood had imagined. The story begins in a laboratory where scientists handle human remains as if they were unexploded evidence. Ancient DNA is fragile. After death, a person, as genetic material, begins breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. Water enters the bone, heat damages the molecules, bacteria invade, fungi spread, soil chemistry changes everything. A skeleton may look solid after 1,000 years, yet much of its surviving DNA may no longer belong to the person at all. It may come from microbes in the ground, or from archaeologists who touched the bones decades earlier. That means researchers cannot simply place an entire Viking skeleton into a machine and receive a perfect genetic profile. They usually search for the densest, best protected parts of the body. One of the most valuable is the petrous bone, located deep inside the skull near the inner ear. Teeth can also preserve genetic material, especially inside their roots. Researchers enter clean rooms wearing protective suits, masks, gloves, and hair coverings. Surfaces are sterilized. Outside air is filtered. A small section of bone or tooth is cleaned, drilled, and reduced to powder. Then chemicals release whatever fragments of ancient DNA remain. Most samples fail to produce a complete genome. Instead, scientists recover millions of damaged fragments and use powerful computers to align them against the human reference genome. Well, it is like reconstructing thousands of burned documents after the wind has scattered the pieces. But once enough fragments are assembled, the dead begin revealing connections that no written chronicle recorded. Their DNA, not photographs. For Viking history, the largest early breakthrough came from a project that studied the genomes of 442 ancient individuals connected to the Viking world. The remains came from archaeological sites spread across Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Estonia, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and other regions. The research, published in Nature in 2020, was one of the largest ancient DNA investigations of Viking-era populations ever attempted. At first glance, the basic picture appeared familiar. People with Scandinavian-related ancestry had moved outward during the Viking Age. Norwegian-associated ancestry appeared strongly in places such as Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. Swedish-associated ancestry appeared farther east around the Baltic. It cannot automatically be labeled Moorish. It may be older. It may come from Roman-era mobility. It may reflect several migrations separated by centuries. And in some regions, those waves became layered on top of one another until their exact origins were difficult to separate. That was the first shocking result. The genetic relationship between Spain and North Africa did not begin with the Muslim conquest. The conquest intensified an existing connection. It did not create it from nothing. Then came the year 701. A force led by Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed from North Africa into Iberia. The army was largely composed of Berbers, or Amazigh people, from the Maghreb, operating under the authority of the Umayyad Caliphate. They defeated the Visigothic king Roderick in a decisive battle whose precise details remain debated. The collapse that followed was astonishingly fast. Within only a few years, Muslim forces controlled most of the As'i Peninsula. Cities surrendered. Local elites made agreements. Some communities resisted. Others accepted new rulers in exchange for protection, property rights, or reduced conflict. A new political world emerged, Al-Andalus. But the word Moor can mislead modern viewers. Medieval European writers used it broadly for Muslims connected with North Africa or Iberia. It did not describe one race, one tribe, or one genetic population. The newcomers included different Amazigh groups, Arabs, soldiers, administrators, families, and later migrants from across North Africa and the wider Islamic world. The population of Al-Andalus also included millions of local Iberians. Many remained Christian. Some were Jewish. Others converted to Islam over generations. A change in religion did not require a change in ancestry. A local Iberian family could become Arabic-speaking and Muslim while remaining largely descended from people who had lived in the peninsula before 711. This is why archaeology, written history, and genetics must be examined together. A Muslim burial does not automatically prove North African birth. An Arabic name does not reveal a person's entire ancestry. A Christian grave does not guarantee that the individual had no Muslim or North African ancestors. Medieval identity was not stored in a single gene. And what happened next made the population even more complex. Al-Andalus did not remain politically united. The Umayyad Emirate became a caliphate, then fractured into competing kingdoms known as taifas. North African dynasties later intervened. The Almoravids arrived in the 11th century. The Almohads followed in the 12th. Christian kingdoms expanded southward in a long and uneven process, later called the Reconquista. Borders moved repeatedly. A city could pass from Muslim to Christian control while much of its population remained in place. People converted, fled, returned, married across communities, or were forcibly relocated. For centuries, Spain was not divided into two clean populations facing each other across a fixed line. It was a moving frontier filled with mixed communities. When researchers studied the DNA of modern Spaniards, they found the genetic shadow of this history. A major 2019 analysis examined more than 1,400 people from across Spain. For hundreds of participants, all four grandparents had been born within roughly 80 kilometers of one another. This allowed researchers to connect genetic patterns with specific regions more precisely. The results showed that Spain contains clear regional genetic structure. People from Galicia, Andalusia, Catalonia, the Basque region, and other areas are not separate biological races, but centuries of local marriage, migration, geography, and political borders produced detectable differences. The genetic map even reflected historical movement from north to south during the centuries of Christian expansion. But the most dramatic finding involved North African-related ancestry. Researchers estimated that modern Iberian populations carried regionally varying levels, ranging from near zero in some areas to around 11% in